At 92 years old, Dorothy had learned that the hardest battles aren't fought against other people. They're fought against the voice in your own head that whispers you're too old, too alone, too late to matter anymore. Sometimes it sounds like your children's voices on the phone, patient and careful. Sometimes it sounds like the doctor adding phrases like, "at your age," as if your years were a diagnosis. And sometimes, the worst times, it sounds exactly like your own voice, rising up in the dark before dawn when the cabin is cold and the ache in your hands is bad enough that you wonder, just for a moment, whether everyone else might be right. For 20 years, Dorothy had been proving that voice wrong, one seed at a time, one jar at a time, one carefully tended generation at a time, in a cabin her late husband built with his own hands, hands that would never hold hers again, but that had left their imprint on every beam, every shelf, every carefully fitted joint in this place that was the truest home she had ever known. When her children tried to take everything, the land, the work, the memory of the man she'd loved for 50 years, Dorothy had to decide, surrender to the easier path everyone expected, or fight for something no one else could see the value of. This is the story of a woman who chose the harder road at an age when most people have stopped choosing anything at all. If you've ever felt invisible because of your age, if you've ever continued working on something no one else believed in, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have known it already, Dorothy's story will remind you why you keep going. Subscribe now, because this community understands that the most important battles are the ones we fight inside ourselves, and that dreams don't age. Dorothy woke at 5:30 on a November morning to darkness and the sound of wind testing the cabin's walls. She lay still for a moment, doing what she'd done every morning for 20 years, taking inventory of her 92-year-old body before asking it to function. Left knee, stiff but not screaming, which counted as a good morning. Right hip, the usual deep ache that would ease after moving but would never entirely leave. Hands, swollen from yesterday's work, the arthritis making her fingers look like tree roots gnarled at the joints but still capable, still hers. Back, tight along the right side, the old compression fracture making its presence known as it had since 1987. She could work with this. She'd worked with worse. The cabin was cold. The wood stove had burned down overnight to nothing but ash and the ghost of last night's warmth. Dorothy pushed herself upright slowly, carefully, with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Falling at 92 meant hospitals and questions and x-rays and concerned faces leaning over her bed, and exactly the scenario her children were trying to force through the courts. Proof that she couldn't manage alone, that the cabin was dangerous, that someone needed to take control. She would not fall. She wrapped herself in James's old wool robe, still on the hook where he'd left it 20 years ago, still a little too large, still carrying some warmth she couldn't entirely explain and didn't need to. She made her way to the stove. Building a fire was meditative work. Crumple newspaper, she still got the weekly paper delivered, drove in every Tuesday to collect it, arrange kindling to allow airflow, strike a match, and watch the flame catch and grow. The kindling caught with a dry crackling sound she had always loved, warmth coming, cold temporary. While the cabin warmed, Dorothy made coffee in the percolator James had bought at a yard sale in 1975. She still remembered that Saturday, a golden October morning. James had spotted the percolator at a farm sale, held it up with the expression he wore when he found a small treasure, eyebrows raised, that private smile, and said, "Dorothy, this is a quality machine. This will outlast us both." He hadn't been wrong. The familiar ritual grounded her. Measure the grounds, add water, set it on the stove. The smell of coffee perking was the smell of 10,000 mornings with James and 7,000 mornings without him, and the comfort was the same in both cases. Some things, Dorothy had learned, transcend the circumstances that created them. Outside, dawn was lightening the sky from black to deep indigo. Dorothy stood at the window with her coffee, looking at the garden beds sleeping under frost. From here they looked simple, rectangular shapes under straw mulch. But Dorothy knew every inch. Which bed held the Cherokee purple tomatoes at their 15th generation? which held experimental crosses being tested for drought resistance, where the soil ran deep and where it thinned toward rock. She knew this land the way you only know something you've worked with your hands for decades, in the body as much as in the mind. And she thought about the phone call she knew was coming today. Margaret Torres, the social worker assigned by the county's Adult Protective Services, had scheduled a formal visit to evaluate Dorothy's living situation. To evaluate, in the careful language of the paperwork Dorothy had received, whether she was maintaining adequate self-care, whether her cognitive function was sufficient for independent living, whether her living environment met basic safety standards, whether she was competent to make her own decisions. The evaluation was the first official step in her children's guardianship petition, and Dorothy knew with absolute clarity what her children hoped Margaret would find: an elderly woman struggling in conditions too harsh for her age, perhaps confused, perhaps neglecting herself, obviously in need of intervention. What Margaret would actually find, Dorothy thought, setting down her coffee mug with slightly more force than necessary, was a woman who had been living here just fine for 2 decades and deeply resented having to prove that to strangers. But proving it was necessary, because if she failed this evaluation, if Margaret wrote a report saying Dorothy showed signs of incapacity, that she was unsafe, that she needed supervision, her children would have the evidence they needed to win the guardianship petition. They would get legal control of her decisions and her property, and they would sell everything. The cabin James built with his own hands across 2 summers, the land they had worked together for 30 years, the collection they had spent 57 years building together for $850,000, divided 3 ways, deposited into accounts that Dorothy had no say over. She set down her coffee and went to the back room, the seed room. Her life's work, hers and James's together, and then hers alone, and somehow both at once, because work begun together doesn't stop being shared just because one of the partners is gone. She opened the door and stood looking at 2,347 glass jars arranged on shelves James had built in 1970, spending an entire weekend measuring and leveling and cursing softly when a board refused to sit flat. "These shelves need to hold 100 years of work," he'd said. "Are they going to be built right?" They had been. 55 years later, not one shelf sagged. Each jar contained seeds, each white paper label written in the small, careful handwriting that Dorothy had developed over decades of documentation, told a story. Cherokee Purple Tomato, 1972, James's grandfather, generation 15. 15 times they had grown this variety from seed, selected the finest plants, saved the seeds with meticulous care, and started again the following spring. 15 generations of careful human selection, each one building on the last. Moon and Stars Watermelon, 1969, believed commercially extinct by 1985, generation 18. A variety that the seed catalogues had stopped offering, that most gardeners had never heard of, preserved here in a glass jar on a hand-built shelf in the Blue Ridge Mountains, alive. Hopi Blue Corn, 1978, received from farmer in Hotevilla, Arizona, generation 12. Seeds given to them by an elder at the edge of his own garden, pressing the envelope into James's hands with both of his own, and saying, in a voice that made the gift feel sacred, "Keep these going. Our young people aren't planting them anymore. We're losing them too fast." James had driven home in near silence that day, thinking. That night he'd said to Dorothy, "I think we've been underestimating what we're doing here." He'd been right. This collection was what gave Dorothy a reason to get out of bed at 5:30 at 92. This was what made her body move through pain that would have been a reasonable excuse to stay still. Work that mattered not in money or recognition, but in the irreplaceable fact that varieties which would otherwise cease to exist were still growing because Dorothy kept showing up to tend them. Work that honored James's memory not as sentiment, but as continuation, the truest form of honoring the dead. Not monuments, but keeping the work alive. Her children saw an old woman playing with seeds when she should be comfortable in a facility, not understanding that without this work, Dorothy would have no reason to be anywhere at all. The sound of an engine on the gravel drive interrupted her thoughts. 7:40. 20 minutes early. Dorothy closed the seed room door and went to prepare for the evaluation that would determine whether she'd be allowed to keep living the life she had chosen. Margaret Torres knocked firmly, professionally. Dorothy took her time answering, not because she was being difficult, but because rushing was dangerous and she refused to fall today of all days. The knock came again, slightly louder, the way people knock when they're already composing notes about response times in their heads. Dorothy opened the door. She saw exactly what she expected, a woman in her mid-50s dressed practically against the cold, holding a clipboard. Her expression was the one Dorothy had learned to read over decades, sympathy mixed with preformed doubt, the look of someone who'd already half decided what they'd find. To her credit, Margaret Torres had kind eyes. Dorothy had learned not to be too moved by kind eyes. "Mrs. Dorothy, I'm Margaret Torres, Adult Protective Services." A slight hesitation at the name, Dorothy noticed. The paperwork apparently only had her first name, the last name deliberately omitted as she'd requested. "Come in, I've made tea." Dorothy stepped aside, and cold air gusted into the cabin along with Margaret, who stomped her boots politely on the mat just inside the door. Dorothy watched her eyes move around the cabin in the systematic way of someone trained to observe, cataloguing, evaluating, measuring the space against some internal checklist. Dorothy saw what Margaret saw, tried to see it fresh, a single main room, small by suburban standards, but large enough for everything that mattered. A wood stove radiating steady heat, its iron sides warm enough that the room was comfortable despite the morning cold outside. A simple kitchen along one wall, a sink with running water from the well, a counter of scrubbed wood, shelves bearing dishes and canned goods in neat rows, labeled in Dorothy's careful handwriting. A table with 2 chairs, positioned to catch the morning light from the east window, a reading chair near the stove, a floor lamp beside it, a stack of books on the small table next to it, novels, botanical references, 2 volumes of her own notebooks, a sleeping area behind a partial wall, everything clean, everything organized, everything exactly as it should be for someone living deliberately rather than barely surviving. "This is your primary residence?" Margaret asked, accepting the offered tea and settling into one of the chairs at the table. Her tone was professionally neutral, but the question carried a freight of judgment that Dorothy had heard before. Of course, this was Dorothy's primary residence. Where else would she live? Where else would she want to live? "For 20 years, Dorothy confirmed, sitting across from her with her own mug of tea. "Since my husband passed." "You've been living here alone all that time?" A pause, then the addition that was the real question. "At your age?" There it was, the issue that colored every conversation about her life now. At your age. As if 92 came with mandatory requirements. Mandatory helplessness, mandatory dependence, mandatory surrender of the choices that made life feel like yours. "I'm 92, not incapacitated," Dorothy said, keeping her voice mild with some effort. "I manage quite well. I have for 20 years. Margaret made notes on her clipboard. Dorothy found herself wondering what she was writing. Subject appears alert, but possibly defensive. Possible denial regarding limitations appropriate to age. "Mrs. Dorothy, your children have initiated guardianship proceedings. They're concerned you're not safe here, that you can't adequately care for yourself, that your judgment may be," she chose the word carefully, "compromised." "My children want $850,000 from the sale of this property," Dorothy said, and she was proud that her voice stayed level, that the fury that lived in her chest these days didn't leak into her words. "They're using my age to justify taking control of assets I own. Let's be clear about what this actually is." Margaret's pen paused. She looked up from her clipboard. "You believe this is primarily financially motivated. I know it is. They haven't visited in 2 years. Richard not since the summer before last. Susan not since last Christmas. And even then, only briefly. They call once a month, 5 minutes on average. I keep track." Dorothy set down her mug. "But the week after a developer made an offer on this land, $850,000 for 40 acres and the cabin, suddenly, my children are desperately concerned about my welfare. Suddenly they're researching assisted living facilities and consulting attorneys about guardianship law. That's not concern. That's opportunism, wearing the costume of concern, and I won't pretend I don't see the difference. So you don't believe your children have any genuine worry for you at all? It was a fair question, and Dorothy was honest enough to give it real consideration rather than answering from anger. I think they've convinced themselves they're worried. People are very skilled at that, finding the version of their motivations that they can live with. It's easier to believe you're rescuing your elderly mother than to admit you're trying to take her money while she's still alive. But no. When I look at the sequence of events, at the timing, at the phone calls in the weeks before they filed, I don't believe care for my well-being is their primary motivation. Their primary motivation is $850,000, divided 3 ways, and the belief that I'm old enough that they can get away with it. Margaret wrote more notes. Dorothy watched her pen move and thought, I cannot tell if this is helping. She had no way of knowing whether her clarity read as competence or bitterness, whether her calmness read as capability or detachment. She was simply telling the truth. Whatever Margaret did with it was beyond her control. Would you show me the rest of your living situation? Your children mentioned you keep extensive gardens. I'll show you everything, Dorothy said, pushing herself upright with one hand on the table, carefully, but not hiding the care required. She was not going to perform a false agility she didn't have. But first, there's something you should see that will help you understand what I actually do here, what my days actually consist of. She led Margaret across the cabin to the door of the back room and opened it. Margaret stepped through the doorway and stopped. Dorothy watched her face change. The professional neutrality cracked, replaced by something genuine, surprise moving into wonder, moving into a kind of recalibration Dorothy could almost see happening in real time. Because what Margaret Torres had been prepared to find was whatever a social worker expects to find in the back room of an elderly woman's remote cabin, perhaps a spare bedroom, perhaps storage, perhaps evidence of disorder or neglect. What she found instead was 2,347 glass jars, arranged on floor-to-ceiling shelves, in a system of perfect order, each one labeled in careful handwriting, each one containing something that had been saved and documented and cared for over decades of patient work. What is this? Margaret asked, and to her credit the question was genuine, not a form to fill out, but actual curiosity. This is 57 years of work, Dorothy said. She moved into the room the way she always moved in here, slowly but with a sense of belonging that she felt nowhere else quite so completely. My husband James and I began collecting and preserving heirloom and heritage seed varieties in 1968. After he passed 20 years ago, I continued the work alone. This collection represents 2,347 distinct varieties of vegetables, herbs, fruits, and flowers, many of them considered commercially extinct, meaning no seed company currently sells them, and they exist, if they exist at all, only in collections like this one, or in frozen storage in government seed banks. She paused to let that register. I maintain living populations of each variety by growing them out in rotation gardens, harvesting seeds annually from the finest specimens, and preserving them here. Every jar is catalogued. Every variety is documented in my notebooks. She gestured toward the row of volumes on a lower shelf, 53 of them now, with complete growing information, variety history, source documentation, and my own observations from decades of cultivation. Dorothy moved to the shelves and picked up one specific jar, holding it at eye level. The seeds inside were mottled red and white, kidney-shaped, beautiful in the way that practical things sometimes are. Jacob's cattle beans, a 19th century New England variety, generation 14, grown and saved 14 times since 1969. Each season, these beans adapt slightly more to this soil and climate. She set the jar back precisely. If we hadn't preserved them, they'd exist only as data in a frozen archive. There is a difference between a record and a living thing, and that difference matters. Margaret moved slowly along the shelves, reading labels, her clipboard held loosely now at her side, rather than in the note-taking position it had occupied throughout their conversation until this moment. Dorothy could see her trying to reconcile what surrounded her with the story she'd been given. The story of an old woman stubbornly refusing appropriate care. "Mrs. Dorothy," Margaret said at last, and her voice had shifted into something less official. "I need to make some phone calls before I complete my assessment. What you're showing me here," she paused, looking for the right words, "this is considerably more than I was led to believe." Dorothy nodded once, precisely. She had thought it might be. After Margaret left, Dorothy stood alone in the seed room for a long time. The morning light had shifted while they talked, moving past the single small window in a way that made the glass jars glow faintly, the seeds inside throwing tiny shadows. She should have been relieved. Margaret's expression, her tone, the way she'd put down her clipboard, all of it suggested the visit had gone well, better than well. But Dorothy stood in her seed room and let herself feel something she had not permitted during the evaluation itself, because she could not afford it then. Fear. Not the surface fear of falling or getting sick. Deeper fear. The fear that even if she proved herself today, even if Margaret Torres wrote the most positive possible report, even if every expert confirmed her work was valuable and her mind was sharp, it still might not be enough. Because at 92, the world had legal mechanisms for deciding that your choices belonged to other people. Because age gave her children leverage that had nothing to do with her actual condition. Because a judge could look at a 92-year-old woman living alone in a mountain cabin and decide, regardless of evidence, that someone else needed to be in charge. Dorothy sat down on the wooden stool James had made. He'd turned the legs himself on a lathe he'd bought second-hand in 1974, a birthday gift to himself that had produced dozens of pieces of furniture over the years, many of them still in daily use. She sat because suddenly standing felt like too much, because the weight of the battle she was fighting felt heavier than her body could carry upright, and she was 92 years old, and she was tired, and she was frightened, and for these few minutes, alone in the room that held 57 years of work, she let herself feel it completely. It wasn't fear of dying. She'd made a kind of peace with dying. It was fear of losing this, of waking in a clean facility room, surrounded by care and the total absence of purpose, of spending whatever years remained being kept comfortable rather than continuing the work, of the seeds staying in their jars, ungrown, slowly losing viability, of James's work, their work, ending not with completion but with abandonment. She closed her eyes and let herself feel James's presence in this room, not a confusion about death, but a truth she'd discovered about places where work is done together over many years. This room held James the way certain music holds the moment you first heard it, in the shelves he'd built, in the organizational system they'd refined together, in the way she still sometimes turned to say something to him before remembering. She remembered the year they'd nearly lost the mortgage-lifter tomato to early blight, a variety developed by a Depression-era Virginia man who'd crossed 4 tomatoes over 6 years and sold enough plants to pay off his mortgage, hence the name. An old farmer had pressed the seeds into James's hand in 1971. "Charlie's gone. I'm the last one growing these." That summer of 1989, blight swept through fast. Only 3 plants survived uninfected. James built makeshift covers from old windows and plastic sheeting and checked them twice a day for 2 weeks, talking to them in the low voice he used with things he was worried about. The fruits ripened. They saved the seeds. He came in to dinner that evening with the look he wore after something difficult was resolved. "Still here," he'd said, and she'd understood he meant more than the tomatoes. Dorothy opened her eyes. The afternoon light had moved further still. She was not James. She was alone where he had been beside her, but she was still here, and she would fight. 3 days later, Dorothy received a call on her satellite phone from a Dr. James Wilson, a botanist in the plant genetics department at NC State University. His name was James. She noticed that right away and then told herself not to read into it. Margaret Torres had sent him photographs of the collection following her assessment visit, photographs Margaret had taken on her phone while Dorothy watched with a complicated mixture of permission and vulnerability. And Dr. Wilson had looked at them and called within 48 hours asking to visit immediately. His voice on the phone had the barely contained excitement she recognized from James whenever he'd found a rare variety at a market or received seeds from a correspondent. The voice of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at and could not quite keep the delight out of his professional tone. For the first time in months, Dorothy felt something loosen in her chest. Someone who understood. Doctor. Wilson arrived the next day with a graduate student named Priya, who spent the visit saying little and writing constantly in a notebook. Dorothy spent 6 hours showing them her system, the organizational logic, the rotation schedule, isolation distances maintained between cross-pollinating varieties, the selection criteria she'd developed over decades. She walked them through the documentation notebooks, 53 volumes, the handwriting in early ones rounded and confident, in recent ones smaller and slower but just as precise, each variety catalogued with source information, growing observations, generation count, and notes on changes observed over the years, changes representing adaptation, the collection slowly becoming more itself. She took them to the outdoor gardens, dormant under November frost, but still readable to someone who knew how to look. The careful terracing, the windbreaks planted over decades, soil amended until it had the depth of something built with intention. She explained isolation distances maintained between varieties, the hand pollination she performed for varieties that needed it, the record-keeping connecting each season to every season before it going back 57 years. And she watched Dr. Wilson's face as he moved through it all, watched him understand the scope and the depth and the duration of what he was seeing, watched him arrive, incrementally, at the same place she had arrived decades ago. The understanding that this was not a hobby collection maintained by a dedicated amateur. This was a systematic scientific undertaking that had been pursued with professional rigor for the better part of 6 decades. When they finally sat at Dorothy's table with tea and the ginger cookies she'd made that morning, she always baked when she was nervous, had learned this about herself years ago, Dr. Wilson spoke with the careful precision of a scientist who was aware he was about to say something significant. "Dorothy, may I?" At her nod, he continued, "What you have preserved here is extraordinary. I don't use that word casually. From what I've seen today, you have at minimum 187 varieties that are commercially extinct, not available from any seed company, not listed in active cultivation in any registry I'm aware of. The USDA National Seed Bank has been actively searching for some of these. Your documentation represents decades of observational data that simply does not exist anywhere else. Data on how these varieties perform over generations, how they adapt, what environmental conditions affect them. You're not just preserving seeds, Dorothy. You're maintaining living populations with genetic diversity, with adaptation history, with documented selection over time. That is categorically different from frozen storage. That is irreplaceable." He paused, looking at her steadily. "I want to say something directly, because I think you need to hear it from someone outside your immediate situation. What you have been doing for 57 years is professional-level scientific work. The fact that you've been doing it without institutional support, without a title, without anyone paying attention, does not diminish that. It makes it more remarkable. And I want to help protect it, which means helping you maintain control of this property and continue this work. With your permission, I'd like to bring in colleagues. Document this comprehensively enough that no one can look at it and call it an old woman's pastime. Make sure that when your case goes before a judge, there is overwhelming evidence of what is actually happening here." Dorothy set down her tea and felt something crack open quietly inside her. A defense held for 20 years, the assumption that no one besides James would ever truly see the value of what they'd built, the loneliness of doing important work while the people closest to you look past it entirely. "Yes," she said, "document what you need to, but understand this clearly. I'm not stopping my regular work for bureaucracy. I have varieties that need to be grown out next season. Spring planting begins planning in December. This collection stays active. Documentation happens around the work, not instead of it." Dr. Wilson almost smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. The next 2 weeks brought a steady stream of visitors Dorothy had never expected to meet. Agricultural scientists from 3 universities, seed bank curators who arrived with white gloves and eyes that widened at the generation numbers on the labels, biodiversity specialists who used vocabulary in situ conservation, living germplasm preservation, adaptive selection, whose meaning Dorothy understood immediately because it described exactly what she'd been doing. Each one confirmed what Dr. Wilson had said. Dorothy had always known her work mattered, had known it in her bones, but there is a difference between knowing something alone and having that knowing reflected back by people who arrived as strangers and left as believers. Dorothy felt that weight added to private certainty, and it felt like relief rather than burden. She found herself explaining her methods over and over, and discovered something she hadn't anticipated, that talking about this work was its own form of preservation, that describing the story behind each variety, the old farmers who'd entrusted seeds, the varieties rescued from near extinction, was an act of carrying those stories forward. James had always loved this part, the telling, had a gift for making the history of a vegetable feel as compelling as any human story. Dorothy had been the quieter one, but now, with people genuinely hungry to understand, she found something of James's pleasure in the telling coming alive in her. One visitor brought news that changed the nature of the fight entirely. Patricia Williams, the regional director of the USDA's Plant Genetic Resources Program, flew in from Colorado on a Thursday and spent most of the day in the seed room. That evening, sitting at Dorothy's table, she made an offer with the directness Dorothy appreciated. The USDA wanted to hire Dorothy as a consultant, $75,000 per year, a formal consulting contract, to document her collection, advise on preservation methodology, and contribute her decades of observational data to the National Plant Genetic Resources Database. $75,000 a year. Employment. Official recognition from the federal government that her expertise had monetary value. Income that would make the property financially secure regardless of what her children attempted. The number mattered. But the number was not, Dorothy realized that night, what made her sit very still at her table for a long time after Patricia Williams left. What made her sit still was the word consultant, the acknowledgement that she was an expert, that at 92, the knowledge built from 57 years of patient work was worth paying for. She was not a problem to be managed. She was a resource. That night, alone in the cabin with the wood stove warm and the snow beginning outside, and the seeds sleeping in their jars in the back room, Dorothy sat in James's chair, the reading chair she'd never been quite able to think of as anything else, and cried, not from sadness and not from the relief of winning, because the hearing hadn't happened yet, and nothing was won. She cried from the release of something she'd been holding for 20 years, the exhaustion of doing important work while the world looked past you, the strain of believing in something alone, the loneliness of carrying a vision that the people closest to you couldn't or wouldn't see. We did something important, she said to the empty cabin, to the photograph on the shelf, James at 50, squinting into summer sun in the garden, holding up a remarkably large squash with that private smile of his. We really did. The wood stove ticked and settled. Dorothy let herself rest in the warmth of that truth, not as something she'd always known, but as something she now knew she would not have to carry alone. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for December 22nd. Dorothy prepared for it the way she prepared for difficult growing seasons, methodically, without panic, focusing on what she could control. She retained an attorney named Michael Rodriguez, a man with a calm manner and a habit of asking questions that seemed simple until you tried answering them. She paid him from her first USDA consulting payment, which felt like more than money, like evidence that the world outside her family recognized her capacity. She gathered documentation, Margaret Torres's positive assessment report, letters from Dr. Wilson and Patricia Williams and 3 other scientists, 53 volumes of notebooks, photographs of the collection and gardens. Everything that demonstrated, objectively, what her days actually consisted of. She prepared herself for the possibility of losing, This was not pessimism, but realism. The same realism that made her save seeds every year, because you cannot count on any single season. A judge could rule against her. She was 92, and in some rooms that number would outweigh everything else. The night before the hearing, Dorothy could not sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to wind against the cabin walls, and thought about James, about what he would say if he could see this. She thought he'd be proud of her. She also thought he'd be heartbroken, not at her, but at the situation, at the fact that the children they'd raised together had arrived at this choice. He'd been a man who believed the best of people whenever there was any reasonable way to do so. She wasn't sure she could have managed that here. Around 3 in the morning, Dorothy got up and went to the seed room. She turned on the single overhead light and stood in the familiar space, feeling its particular quality of silence. Not empty silence, but full silence, the kind that comes from a room where living things are resting. She walked along the shelves slowly, fingertips brushing the jars. Brandywine Tomato, 1968. Our first year together, Generation 17. Before they even knew it would become a collection, James had bought the seeds on a whim, liking the name, and they'd grown the most extraordinary tomatoes she'd ever tasted, deeply ridged, the color of a sunset, a flavor so complex it seemed impossible. "We have to save seeds from these," James had said, juice running down his chin. "Future generations need these." He'd been 31. He'd meant it literally. Kentucky Wonderpole Bean, 1969, grew every year after Generation 17. The beans James had grown up with, his mother's beans, the beans of his childhood summers in eastern Tennessee. He'd found seeds through a family connection, his second year of the collection, and grown them faithfully for 34 years. Dorothy had grown them faithfully for 20 years after, 17 generations. She could taste them just from the memory. Purple hulled peas, 1975, traded at the Wytheville Farmers Market. Generation 14, a brilliant August Saturday at the market. A woman named Alma had admired Dorothy's Cherokee purples. They'd traded seeds and phone numbers and begun a correspondence that lasted until Alma died in 2003. Each jar was a relationship, a story, a thread connecting backward through decades. Losing this collection would not just be losing property or work. It would be losing James again. Losing the marriage they'd had not just in daily life, but in this shared project that had given their weekends meaning. That had been their way of mattering beyond their own existence. Dorothy sat down on James's stool and let herself feel the full weight of what she might lose tomorrow. She didn't cry. She sat with it the way you sit with something too large to argue with, not resisting it, not retreating from it, but letting it be fully present, so she would know exactly what she was fighting for when morning came. At 4:30, she returned to bed and slept an hour. When she woke at 5:30, she made coffee, built the fire, and dressed carefully in the clothes she'd chosen. A simple, dark dress, James's wool coat, her good boots. In the small bathroom mirror, 92 years old, dark eyes still sharp, white hair pinned back. This face, this is who I am. She went to court. The courthouse was warm from radiators working hard against December cold. Dorothy sat with Michael Rodriguez at the table on the left, aware with particular acuity of her 92 years, in a way she usually managed to ignore. Her children sat on the right with their attorney, Richard with the set jaw he'd worn since boyhood, when he believed he was right, Susan with red-rimmed eyes, and Michael, the youngest, who looked like he'd rather be somewhere else entirely. Also in the courtroom, Dr. Wilson in the third row, notebook open on his knee, Margaret Torres, composed and professional, Patricia Williams, who had flown back from Colorado for this, Jennifer Park from the Raleigh News and Observer, who had broken the story 3 weeks ago in an article that went viral, read by people across the country who found in it something they recognized about their own invisible battles. Judge Martha Thompson entered, early 60s, silver hair cut short, the unhurried manner of someone who had heard a great many cases and was not going to be rushed through this one. She had reviewed extensive materials before this day, the guardianship petition and its supporting arguments, the social worker's assessment, the expert letters, the media coverage. Now she would hear testimony and make the decision that would determine what remained of Dorothy's life. The children's attorney argued first. 92 years old in a remote mountain cabin was inherently dangerous. Dorothy's refusal to accept supervision demonstrated impaired judgment. Her intense focus on seeds to the exclusion of conventional self-care showed an inability to properly prioritize. Someone needed to be legally responsible, Richard testified. Dorothy listened and understood that somewhere underneath the financial motivation was something genuine, a real fear of losing her. She filed it away. Susan cried. Michael said little. Under cross-examination, the children admitted visits totaling fewer than 10 days in 2 years. Calls averaging 1 per month, 4 to 6 minutes each. Guardianship discussions began within days of learning the property's value. $850,000, the actual subject of the proceeding. Then, Dorothy's witnesses testified. Margaret Torres described a woman not just competent but impressive. Dr. Wilson explained the collection's scientific significance, what the documentation demonstrated about cognitive function, what 57 years of generation numbers actually meant. Patricia Williams explained why the USDA had hired Dorothy, because the knowledge she possessed could not be replicated. Then Judge Thompson looked at Dorothy and said, "Mrs. Dorothy, I'd like to speak with you directly." Dorothy walked to the witness stand slowly, the way she did everything, not performing ease she didn't have. She sat upright in the witness chair. "Why do you choose to live as you do, alone, in such a remote location, at 92 years old?" Dorothy had prepared for this question. She had an answer ready, rehearsed, sensible. It covered safety precautions and emergency systems, and the USDA contract, and the documented value of her work. She opened her mouth to give that answer and then paused. The prepared answer was true, but it was not the deepest truth, and this moment, she felt, required the deepest truth she could offer. "Your Honor, I'm 92 years old. I've lived long enough to understand that comfort and meaning are not the same thing. I could be in a facility, warm, safe, with people around me, and also slowly hollowing out, because the thing that makes me rise each morning would be gone. Instead, I'm in the cabin my husband built, continuing the work we started together. That work gives me a reason to get up at 5:30 regardless of how much my hands hurt. It is the only form of grief that has ever helped me. Not stopping, but continuing. Not shrines, but seeds. My children believe I should prioritize safety over purpose. Safety matters, I know that, but I've watched people surrender their purpose and survive their own deaths by years. I have no interest in that. Taking my choice from me because I'm 92 is not protection. It is an assumption that age has made me incompetent. I am not incompetent. I am old, in pain, and doing work that matters. Those things are not in conflict. They are simply the truth of my life." Judge Thompson looked at Dorothy for a long moment. Something in her expression had shifted during the testimony. Not judgment, but genuine attention. The look of someone who had stopped thinking about a case and started thinking about a person. "If I deny this petition, Mrs. Dorothy, will you accept reasonable safety measures? I already have an emergency communication system. I accept periodic welfare checks, as long as they're conducted by neutral parties rather than by individuals with financial interests in a particular outcome. I accept reasonable precautions. What I don't accept is management by people who want profit from taking my autonomy. Those are different things." The judge nodded. She called a brief recess. The 20 minutes felt longer than any 20 minutes Dorothy could remember. She sat with Michael Rodriguez and did not talk, because there was nothing useful to say. She had made her argument. It was done. Judge Thompson returned. "I've reviewed all evidence presented and heard all testimony. My ruling is as follows. The guardianship petition is denied in its entirety." A sound moved through the courtroom. Not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two. The judge continued, "Mrs. Dorothy has demonstrated full cognitive capacity and is living independently by informed, conscious choice. She maintains her property competently. She engages in work of documented scientific value. She has established and maintains reasonable emergency systems. There is no legal basis for limiting her autonomy. Furthermore, the timing of this petition, initiated within weeks of the discovery of the property's development value, combined with the petitioner's documented minimal involvement in Mrs. Dorothy's daily life prior to this filing, raises serious questions about the primary motivations underlying this action. She looked at Dorothy's children. The petition is denied. Quarterly welfare checks will be conducted by neutral adult protective services personnel. No future guardianship petitions may be filed without substantial documented evidence of actual cognitive incapacity. This case is closed. Dorothy felt everything release at once. Not dramatically, but slowly, like a spring held under tension for months finally allowed to return. She had won. The property was hers. The work could continue. Whatever years remained belonged to her. Richard and Susan left without speaking to her. Michael paused near the door, then looked away and followed his siblings. Dr. Wilson and Patricia Williams embraced her. Outside, snow was falling in the soft, unhurried way that mountain snow sometimes falls. Dorothy stood in it for a moment before the drive back up the mountain. She was free. Spring came with its indifference to winter's drama, and Dorothy planted her gardens at 93. She worked more slowly than the previous year. Her right hip had worsened through the cold months, requiring a cane on difficult days. But she worked. She selected plants for seed saving with the same care she'd always brought to it, watched each variety through its season, hand-pollinated the varieties that needed it in the early morning with a small brush, moving pollen from blossom to blossom with the focused delicacy of a watchmaker. The young couple in the old farmhand's cottage, Dave and Keisha in their 30s, found through a sustainable agriculture network, helped with heavy work Dorothy's body could no longer manage. They were learners as much as helpers, bringing an energy to the place that she hadn't realized it had been missing. Keisha had a particular aptitude for seed saving, learning quickly, asking the right questions. Dorothy found herself thinking practically about continuation. It was a real problem and deserved real thought. Susan visited monthly now. Richard had not contacted Dorothy since the hearing, a silence holding both pain and honesty she respected more than false reconciliation. Michael sent a careful Christmas card expressing something between apology and confusion. But Susan came. Conversation came slowly at first, then more easily, then with a quality of realness that their relationship had rarely had. She asked questions about the collection, learned variety names, helped with documentation. One May afternoon, while they were planting beans, Susan straightened up from where she'd been kneeling and looked at Dorothy with an expression she hadn't seen before. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry we tried to take this from you. I don't think there's a version of an apology that's adequate, but I understand now why you couldn't leave this, why you fought the way you did. I can't say I understand it completely, but I see that it matters to you more than safety or comfort, or any of the things we thought should come first. Your judgment about your own life should have been enough for us. I'm sorry it wasn't." Dorothy stopped planting and looked at her daughter, 62 years old, kneeling in a garden she'd never paid attention to before, getting dirt on her good genes, saying the hardest words. "Thank you," Dorothy said. It wasn't full forgiveness. That takes longer, but it was a beginning. Susan finally seeing her mother as someone who had made considered choices rather than a problem to correct, the foundation of something that might, over time, become genuinely close. They went back to planting. The afternoon light was long and golden, the beans going into the ground one by one, each a small act of faith in another season. In June, Dorothy turned 93. Keisha brought a cake. Dr. Wilson drove up from Raleigh with his wife. Susan came with her husband and her youngest daughter, who regarded the seed room with the wide-eyed seriousness of someone encountering something they have no category for. "Every jar is different?" the girl asked. "Every one," Dorothy confirmed. "Some have been in jars like these since before your grandmother was born." The child considered this with a gravity Dorothy found unexpectedly moving. In the fall, NC State held a formal ceremony designating Dorothy's collection a National Genetic Resource Collection, official protection status, preservation funding, and a plaque accepted graciously in front of people who stood and applauded a 93-year-old woman in James's coat. Dr. Wilson spoke about 57 years of systematic work, varieties saved from extinction, the particular value of things done quietly over a long time, without waiting for recognition. Dorothy spoke briefly. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm better at keeping seeds alive. Let me keep doing what I'm good at." The laughter was warm. That night, back in the cabin, Dorothy hung the plaque on the wall beside the photograph of James. James at 50, squinting into summer sun, holding up an extraordinary squash, that private smile. She stood looking at both for a long time. "We did it," she said, not loudly. They said it mattered. It really, genuinely mattered. She knew that this truth would have meant everything to him, that he'd have read the plaque and then gone immediately to check on something in the seed room, because that was James. Always turning from the recognition back to the work, because the work was the point. The seeds would continue. Keisha and Dave were training in earnest now, learning not just the tasks, but the reasons, building the understanding to carry the work forward. Dr. Wilson's graduate students came regularly. Susan's daughter at 11 had asked to help in the garden next summer. The collection would not end with Dorothy. That knowledge, that the work was larger than her now, held by the world rather than by her alone, let Dorothy rest in a way she hadn't been able to for years. Let her wake each morning with the lighter feeling of continuing something worth continuing rather than the weight of sole responsibility. She had done what she set out to do. Everything after, coffee in James's percolator, fire in James's stove, seeds sleeping in their jars, was continuation. And continuation was enough. If you've ever felt invisible because of your age, if you've ever fought to keep doing work no one else valued, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have known it already, if you've ever continued alone after your partner was gone, Dorothy's story is for you. Share this with someone who needs to remember that age doesn't equal irrelevance, that work done quietly and without recognition still matters, that the hardest battles are the ones we fight inside ourselves against the voice that says we're too old, too late, too alone to make any difference. This is the community that knows purpose keeps you alive at any age, that what you preserve and pass forward matters more than what you accumulate, that the truest legacy is work that outlasts you, carried forward by hands you helped prepare, until the next story.